Hello everyone, this is GM Josh Fidel, and today I'd like to talk about how to trade pieces and when to trade them. Basically, I'm doing, this is part of my series with critical decision making. The basic idea is I want to talk about a very basic concept in chess, break it down, and use an example or two to kind of illustrate some of the points I'm trying to make. Often I'm using current games, sometimes I might choose past games that happened a while back. It's more about the position than about the game itself. So I'm not so worried about which game I'm choosing, but I like to choose current games because sometimes they're fresh in people's minds and they can kind of get an idea of how someone would look at them. So first we have this position. This was actually from a title Tuesday in 2020 between Alexander Donchenko and Artyom Timofeev, two very strong grandmasters. And in this position, white has a choice, and to go with basically, today's concept is the choice is: do we play the move bishop h6 and try to trade the bishops, more specifically this move, or do we not play this move? Do we play something else? And I was curious what you guys thought, whether you thought it was best to play it or not. So if you have a guess, you can pause your video, or if you want to try to figure it out. Again, taking time for these decisions is important, but I'm curious what you guys think here. So pause your video. For those of you who want to keep going, the basic gist is, how do you decide when to trade pieces or not? So there are lots of different factors you have to think about when you're thinking of trades. One of them is the obvious one: which piece is better? That's actually a pretty tricky concept because a lot of the times pieces look better than they are or not. Trading the fianchettoed bishop is a very common one, and actually both examples today will feature a very similar decision on whether to trade a bishop that's fianchettoed. In general, trading a fianchettoed bishop is usually good because, number one, it is a piece that is often very good because it's usually on a nice diagonal, and it also usually protects a castled king. Now, there are exceptions to this. For example, in the King's Indian defense, where there's a pawn on e5 and a pawn on d5 and the bishop's hemmed in, it's usually not a good piece and you should not trade it, right? But when you're trying to attack the king, it's usually a pretty good idea to trade off a fianchettoed bishop. So it's a theme you see a lot in a position like this. So then there's the question of time. And time, I'd say, is a very important one, which is, do I lose time making this trade? And I think this is one of the things that people forget about, and I think it's a good continuation to my last video. If you haven't checked it out, you can check it out on my channel, which is about the importance of time and factoring that into decision making. Here, time still matters. If you lose a lot of tempi to trade the bishop, you should not do it, usually. Whereas if you either lose no time or lose just a move, like any other move, like if you castle, you're spending a move to castle, right? If you lose just one move, then it's no big deal. But time is another important factor. And sometimes there's also a factor of space. If you have more space, then you generally don't want to trade. So here that would point to not trading. But as you can see, the bishop on g7 is one of the pieces that you definitely probably want to trade because it is such a good piece here. And there's also concepts like, if you're attacking, do you want to trade? Well, it depends. If it's a piece that's key to defending, like that bishop, then yes. So you can tell, like in this position, I'm very much leaning towards trading, and I do think that bishop h6 is a very good move here. But there is a fine line with it. And let me actually show you. So the previous move, black played bishop g7, which is actually, believe it or not, probably a mistake. And what they maybe should play is a move like queen c7, which looks very similar. Like, okay, they're improving their queen instead of improving their bishop. But check this out. Now, if white plays bishop h6, which is actually not a very good move, black can play c5, and believe it or not, white's already in some trouble. Because yes, they can take here and ruin black's castling, but for that, you have this very weak e4 pawn. If you try to play knight g3 to defend it, I play c4, and now you're going to lose it anyway. And all of a sudden, your position's horrible. Like, the e4 pawn's under huge fire, and your center's collapsing on you. So you can see how it's actually not so simple. Like, here, you very much should not trade. And it's not to do with the trade necessarily, it's to do with the fact that c5 is a problem. So probably it's better to play a move like castles. But the advantage now is that if bishop g7, now I can play bishop h6. However, after castles, the fact that white's castled means that it's much less likely black's going to get horribly attacked on the king side. And we'll get to that later. In the game, bishop g7 was played, bishop h6. And here, black decided to castle. If they take and try to play queen c7 now, for instance, it just doesn't work as well because white has a move, right? It's all about time. White has a move to stop c5, which means they can play something like c3. And if c5, this is actually rather important. You don't play a move like knight g3, even though it looks logical, because now after c4, you have to go back this way, and b3, your pieces are hemmed out of the game. This is actually a very common trick in some Lopez's, where you play c4, b3, it loses your attack on the center, which is not so good. You usually want to keep your pressure on the center. But because it basically kills two pieces, it's very good. If black can get an e5 here, those pieces are dead for a long time. So something to watch out for, but white can play knight d2. And the problem black has here is that, yes, you can try to play c4 and try to open the position, but keep in mind, if you open the position with your king in the center, even though you're winning this central pawn, you're going to have some problems at some point. So maybe takes with the knight, for example, and let's say bishop takes e4, we trade, and then bring the knight back to e3, for instance. You cannot castle, your king is stuck, I'm ready to castle any time. So for me, at least, this is a position which looks very dangerous. You have to calculate moves like takes on c3, right? But the problem is with a pin at the end, I don't think you're going to be able to do it. So this is already a position I would be very, very nervous for black. Even though you've taken that central pawn for the pawn that's not as central, your king is in trouble. And this is an example of why bishop h6 is very strong here, because black really wants to castle, and they do in the game. And what's funny is in this game, and this is again a Title Tuesday, it's a blitz game, so there are usually lots of mistakes in blitz games. Here, probably white should just go on the attack, either with h4 directly. The idea being now that after this, you're threatening knight g5, h5, this is horrible. And in this position, you're also threatening h5, like you're threatening to just destroy black over there. So black probably has to try to keep you out this way. But once again, this knight d2 move, which is a common theme because it fights against c5 in a lot of positions, is very strong. And you're going to play f3 and probably g4, and you're basically going to rip up black's king side, and it's going to be a very, very unpleasant position for black, in my opinion. Maybe the simpler way is actually just to take, is to take on g7 and play e5, and after something like takes knight d5, now h4. And it's the same idea, basically. You're going to play h5 and try to attack. And I'd say that black's a bit slow in defending against this attack. But notice how, because you have the rook on h1, because you have h4, h5, trading off that bishop was crucial to the success of your position. In the game, castles was played, which is actually quite a big mistake. Because first of all, okay, if you take on h6 and allow knight g5, maybe there's an attack. But if black doesn't take on h6, you don't really get a great attack. And after the move c5, all of a sudden you have the same problems as before, which is that your center is kind of falling apart a little bit. And because you didn't follow up the trade with the attack, it's not nearly as strong. And here black has that extra time to put a lot of pressure on you. So for example, if you play knight g3, I have takes and knight c5, and all my pieces are aimed at the center and at your e4 pawn, which is very good for black. And if something like d5, I can play c4 anyway, and simply come back, and now knight b6 is going to be a very big problem with the d5 pawn being weak. Sure, you can try to play queen h6, knight g5, but in the end, you're not really threatening all that much. So I should be able to defend against any threats you have. In the game, actually, e5 was played, and we just have a position. I mean, they ended up drawing eventually. But I would say this position is now more or less normal, where, you know, black is not getting mated, but white has maybe a little bit of central pressure, and the game kind of continues. So I wanted to show this example of the bishop trade and how it works. And next, I'd like to move to an even more recent example. And this was from the game Erigaisi against Carlsen. This was from the Julius Baer Generation Cup. And for those of you who saw that final, you may have seen this position. This was from the knockout, I believe, on the second day. It was actually a Pierce, but we have so a similar opening and a similar position to what we had in the other game. And in this position, the question is, do you play bishop h6 trying to trade off the bishop or not? So once again, you can pause. And And if you do, I would try to find what you want to do. So if you want to play bishop h6, you want to calculate why that is. If you don't, maybe find a different move and give some good reasons for it. So if you want to pause now, go right ahead. For everyone else, or if you're done. The basic difference here, so this is a similar kind of position from the same opening, but you can see how in this position I actually think that playing bishop h6 is a very big mistake. It's one of those where computer doesn't like it, of course, but it doesn't think it's as bad as I would think it is, and I think that ultimately it's the decision that made him lose this game. As far as what I would play, I really liked the move h5. Seemed very natural. I can understand sacrificing a pawn against the world champion is a nerve-wracking thing, but ultimately I think that if you give most very strong players this position, regardless of who they're playing, they're going to want to play this move, right? Or a move similar, because the idea is that now if knight takes h5, and if you don't take the pawn, takes on g6 is too big of a problem. You have different choices. I think the option I liked wasn't favored by the computer as much, but I just simply like this and bishop d3, and then queen h1 is even a move. But maybe even just queen e2 and just bring the knight in. So something like knight d2, maybe f4, f5. If black plays e6, this knight on g7 is hemmed out forever. And this position is, I think, very, very unpleasant for black. Personally, I don't like it. Again, it's kind of weird because the knight on b1 looks terrible, and I actually don't like how white played the early opening. But I think Magnus maybe let him back in again. Again, it's a rapid game in a very complex position, so mistakes come by the bundles in positions like this. It's very hard, even for very strong GMs like these players, to play. But this position, at least to my eyes, looks very unpleasant. You also don't have to sacrifice a pawn. You can play a move like g4 is completely fine, maybe bishop d3 and then g4 or h5. I just didn't want to allow g4, h5 for black. I feel like that makes it a little easier to play because you at least relieve a little bit of the pressure. But bishop h6, I think, is clearly not a good decision. And you can see why based on the game. So first of all, there was the question of tempi. Now, it doesn't necessarily cost the tempo because it depends how you think about it. If you think about bishop h6 and then black gets a move like you would normally, and then after takes, it's white's move. But to my mind, it still kind of loses a tempo because black has not moved this f8 bishop at all. And one of the nice rules that people get taught when they're young, and of course you learn there are a zillions of exceptions to this, but is that you don't trade a piece off on the back rank. And the main logic behind it is that you've moved this bishop 3 times and black has moved their bishop 0 times. And you've traded off the same pieces. So basically black kind of gets those moves. That's not really how it works. There's all sorts of nuances behind this. But I would argue that unlike in positions with the fianchettoed bishop, on an open diagonal, here this bishop is not a good piece for black. So you're trading a centralized bishop, which is very important, for a piece which is not centralized. Another issue, and you can see by the highlights, is that you've weakened the dark squares around your center, which again, the black bishop had no ability to control. And now you have to worry about moves like c5. Another factor for me is that in this position, if you look at this position, does black really want to castle kingside? One of the main purposes of playing a move like bishop h6 is you want to prevent castling. We saw how effective that could have been in the previous example, where either black castles and then you want to trade off the bishop and attack, or black doesn't castle and their king in the center is very poor. We saw how that in the previous example. Here, I can't imagine a world where black castles anytime soon because white's attack is going to be just right down their throat immediately. So I can't imagine black castling here, in fact. In those h5, g4 lines, there's no way black's going to castle. So even though you are taking away castling rights, and maybe this is what factored into Arjun's decision, there's no real reason to take away castling rights because your opponent is not castling. So I think that all of these things add up a little bit. You can't purely make these decisions by logic. You can't always just figure it out that way. But if you calculate while using logic as a tool, you're going to be far more likely to make these decisions correctly. It's very, very difficult, especially during a game. Imagine you're playing the world champion, you got to do something with your position. I mean, it's a kind of pressure that makes even really strong players make poor decisions. But it's a good way to kind of, you can use examples like this to learn how to make those decisions in your games. And if you get something more similar, or you get those positions where you have to decide where to trade, it can be really useful. just to show you what happened here, probably white should try something like queen e3, trying to slow down c5. But it's very, very difficult to prevent it. I feel like black's going to get it in at some point anyway. So again, I think computer thought it was about equal, but I would never want to take white here. I feel like the idea of c5 is very strong. The knight on b1 I really hate. And black's king is kind of fine here. So at least personally, I would take black, but maybe it's just a personal bias or something. However, after rook h2, queen c7, already Arjun found himself in very difficult territory. I think he even got chances later, but his position is so unpleasant to play, and it's easy to think you're just losing that. I think he lost very badly here. In the end, probably he should play g3 and then try to at least get his knight back in the game, and king b1, and the rook on h2 helps guard c2. He played h5, which doesn't really do a whole lot. And now after c5, which maybe he just wasn't anticipating, he just got a really rotten position, and this ends up just being very, very bad for him. So I think he got chances later, but I think this was the start of a position which is just so unpleasant to play. And of course, facing a world champion does not help. In any case, I hope that this video helped illustrate how you can maybe make some of these decisions better about trading. So remember, with trades, you want to figure out which piece is better, which piece is doing more. Do I lose time by initiating a trade, or does my opponent have to lose time, or is it about even? What are the plans after with a trade? Like, am I trading off a really crucial piece for my plan or for my opponent's plan? If I attack, like in these cases, am I trading off a bishop that's going to help them defend? Am I eliminating castling rights? Does that matter? Obviously, a lot of trades have nothing to do with that, but I'm really illustrating this particular trade. And then there's the question of just, do I have more space, and is it crucial to keep pieces on the board? Am I trading off a really strong attacking piece of mine, or am I trading off a key defender, or vice versa, right? So these kind of, thinking about this kind of thing, in addition to calculating whether it's a good move or not by just looking ahead, really gives you a good chance of making a good decision. And ultimately, I think chess is about making as many good decisions as possible, and probably more importantly, as few bad decisions as you possibly can. So it's a bit oversimplified, but there you go. In any case, I hope you found this video interesting, and maybe as well as the position, and hope you were able to learn something from it. So thanks for watching. Appreciate it.